at 5 Council we, the Greater Shepparton City Council, begin today's meeting by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay respect to their tribal elders, we celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Item number 2, our privacy notice. This public meeting is being streamed live via our Facebook page and made available for the public access on our website, along with the official minutes of this meeting. All care is taken to maintain your privacy. However, as a visitor in the public gallery, it is assumed that your consent is given in the event that your image is broadcast to the public. It is also assumed that your consent is given to the use and disclosure of any information that you share at the meeting, including personal or sensitive information, to any person who accesses those recordings or minutes. Item number 3, Councillors' apologies. Any councillor move to note the apologies of Councillor Abdullah and Councillor Ozavari?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I'll move the recommendation that the apologies from Councillor Abdullah and Councillor Ozavari be noted and a leave of absence be granted.
Thank you, Councillor Hazeman. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. All in favour? Motion carried. Declarations of conflict of interest. Do we have any declarations, councillors, of any conflicts of interest? No? Thank you. Item number 5, our confirmation of minutes of previous meetings. Is any item of the minutes opposed? If I could please have a councillor to move the recommendation on page 1.
Madam Mayor, I'm happy to move the recommendation on page 1 that the minutes of the ordinary council meeting held on the 19th of December 2017 as circulated be confirmed.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a seconder, please?
I'll second that, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. All in favour? Motion carried. Item number 6, we have no questions in tonight, no public questions. Peter, thank you. Councillors, we now go to item number 7.1, Contract 1785, Cosgrove 3 Cell 1 Construction Panel Award recommendation on page 2, and the recommendation is on page 3. Do I have a councillor wishing to move the motion? Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Giovanetti, do you wish to speak?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'm happy to move the recommendation on page 3, which is that Council accept the tender submitted by Apex Earthworks, 907 Golden Valley Highway, for a lump sum contract for Cosgrove 3 Cell 1, a rehab of the for the contract value of $3,567,321.29, and that we authorise the CEO to sign and seal contract documents. This particular contract, Madam Mayor, consists of 3 areas of work, which is the construction of Cosgrove 3 Cell 1 and leachate ponds, construction of the stormwater pond and rehab of the Cosgrove clay borrow pits. There were 6 tenderers that tendered for the works, and it was adjudged that Apex Earthworks were the preferred tenderer.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'd like to mention how fortuitous we are to actually have a landfill. The state government have recently tried to limit landfills, and we can see here that they're also very expensive. It just reflects why we can't keep putting waste in the ground, and diversion is really important. The community should be congratulated for how they use the 3-bin system. They've done a great job there, even through interesting times such as China deciding not to take recycles. So that just demonstrates we need to find more end markets for recyclable material or any waste. We need to embrace innovation and be less wasteful as a society, so that one day maybe we won't even need to have landfills.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would anyone wish to speak against the motion? Would anyone like to speak to the motion? Councillor Giovanetti, any closing comments?
No, Madam Mayor.
Okay, we'll now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, we'll now go to item 7.2 on page 7, Whole of Sport Plan for Cricket, and the recommendation is on page 7. Do I have a councillor wishing to move a motion?
I'll move that, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Sutton. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, this is the first of series of these coming to council in the next couple of years, I suppose. It's about engaging the cricket community, and it's basically concentrating on participation, infrastructure and capacity building, and helping with those clubs that are already supporting cricket in the region. It's a lot of work going on with Cricket Victoria to see how we can help them, how we can define the game better, how we can set up resources better, and it'll eventually work its way down to every sport. This is the first of two that we're dealing with tonight, and there's going to be a lot more sports done during the course of the year, and it's about our health policy of getting people back into sport, getting them off the couch, etc. The more opportunities we can put out there for people to play sport, in this particular case cricket, the better off we all are, especially those people who are getting off the couch. And as we look around, a few councils here could do with getting off the couch and running around chasing a cricket ball. Yeah, it's very important we do that, and this is just one example, as I said, and Cricket Victoria has been very much involved in it, and it'll continue to be, and they'll work through different sports with different state organisations, different national bodies, etc., to see where we can help. Tennis is one that's it's undergoing a lot of pressure at present, and it's important we help them out where we can.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor Sutton, would you like to speak to the motion?
Dennis has said it all.
I think he's done a good job. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak for the motion? We'll now go to the vote. Those in... Oh, sorry, any closing comments, Councillor Patterson?
No, thank you. I'll roll that one straight through.
Thank you so much. We'll now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. We'll now go to item 7.3, whole of sport plan for tennis, on page 13, and page 13, yes, and the recommendation is also on page 13. Do I have a councillor wishing to move a motion?
Madam
Thank
Mayor.
you, Councillor Summer. Do I have a seconder, please?
Second
Councillor
motion,
Adam.
Madam Mayor.
Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
Only to reiterate what Councillor Patterson said earlier. It's all about health. It's all about getting people engaged. Sports are the backbone of a lot of regional communities, and with our sports precinct as well, it helps to position us as a sporting capital of Victoria.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Adam?
Not really, Madam Mayor, except to say what Councillor Patterson said in respect to the cricket whole sport plan, I think applies exactly to this as well. It's a great step forward, I think.
Councillor Adam. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? To the motion?
Can I just speak to it, please?
Sure.
I know with tennis, it's been under more pressure than a lot of the other sports. And I know when we had Country Week here, we've had a few other tennis tournaments, that's really helped those clubs that have actually supporting visiting teams that come and play on their courts, and it's a way of raising some funds for them. So it's very much, it's not just a little grab of tennis, it's a holistic approach where we can help that club as well as help the players, and by doing that we can hopefully promote the game.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Summer?
President, Councillor Patterson used the word holistic.
Return serve really quick, didn't it?
Okay, we will now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, we now go to item 8.1, New Shepparton Art Museum Project Cost Report. The recommendation is on page 20. Do I have a councillor wishing to move a motion? I'll need a councillor to move a motion, please.
Madam Mayor, I'll move the recommendation as printed on the agenda on page 20, that the Council endorse the functional design option estimate for the New Shepparton Art Museum project of $39.9 million, GST exclusive, as detailed in this report.
Thank you, Councillor Hazeman. Do I have a seconder, please?
I'll second the motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Hazeman, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Look, no doubt there will be a lot of debate, discussion, conjecture in the community about this project, as there has been from the outset. And from the outset, the focus of that discussion revolved around what was suggested to be the estimated capital value of $34.5 million for this building. What was glossed over, and it's well worthwhile reading or rereading the motion that was adopted by Council at the time, is that the estimated capital value of $34.5 million was subject to a range of, or 6 particular dot points in that motion, including the architectural design, construction plans, planning and building permits, Victoria Park master plan update, governance model and transition, and project timelines and milestones. And of course, since the moving of that motion, the funding has been secured from Council, State Government, Federal Government, and of course, now having engaged the architects, we have a more clearer picture of what the costs would be. It would have been far more accurate if we'd have focused back in 2015 on the fact that at that point in time the costs were 34.5, knowing full well that business costs and construction costs escalate over time, and in reality, that it was going to be a variation. Although working with the architect, we're going to do everything we possibly can to reduce the costing, to ensure that we maintain the scope of the business case, and ensure that we end up with the product that we particularly wanted. There are some opportunities in here. I mentioned 3 arms of the funding model. I didn't make comment in relation to the SAM Foundation, but at the time there was a funding model put forward of 4.5 for capital and additional 8 million for ongoing support of the operational costs. I think from a personal perspective there is some scope to revisit that arrangement and to ensure that whatever funding is forthcoming from the foundation, we maximise that funding, but we also make sure that it goes into bricks and mortar rather than the operational aspects of the building.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I think Councillor Hazelman has actually covered every aspect and topic of what I wish to say, except that I think the key word here in the recommendation is the word estimate, and that's something that has always been in the business case and the feasibility study, but probably wasn't well communicated as by councillors and by the organisation as I feel it should have been. So that being said, it's always been technically correct. Of course, the cost of any project increases. I think at about a 4 to 5%. That's a standard sort of an appreciation each year. That being said, I believe that figure is very close to the mark, but as Councillor Hazelman rightly pointed out, the designers or the architects are very confident they could bring it in potentially under that figure, so I'm comfortable with that.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? Councillor Summer?
Objecting again, because I think that this recommendation actually sets up another potentially unrealistic expectation in the community. This sort of reads that it's the final sum when in fact we will not know how much it's going to cost until it actually gets to tender. So Councillor Hazelman is quite right that costs do escalate. So by the time we actually have this in front of us, it might potentially blow out to half that again. So there's things that we haven't considered in the costing, such as consultants, but there's so much more as well that haven't actually been included in this, such as operational costs, what to do with our current SAM space. Any recent demolitions aren't included in that, ground rehab, any external amenities like car parking. We need to go back and review the whole thing and get an accurate estimate of the total cost of this project and the whole of life cost of this project. Personally, as far as the foundation goes, I'm very disappointed that we're moving forward on this without getting even close to what we were requesting as part of the business case. And that shows again the failings of that business case, which is a foundation of why this may not be a success. We should not put one sod, we shouldn't be turning any sods in the ground until we at least get half of what the foundation said they would deliver.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would any councillor wish to speak for the motion?
I'll speak for the motion, Madam Mayor. Working on Councillor Summer's theory, it would basically never build anything, in case we had a cost escalation. Where Council probably did go wrong at the very start, going back in 2014-15, the 34.5 was mentioned as the price. Now you can ask or argue that there should have been another figure put in, which has been put in, the 39,500, and that's completion in 2020, which is 2 years away. So currently, if we were to build it tomorrow, it'd be still cheaper than that. So I'm happy that it'll be built for that. I just see it as, I'm not an art person, but I can just see it doing that much good for our town by attracting people that are professionals in their field that we don't have now and giving them something to do. We're all happy to go to Deakin Reserve and use the umpire. People that are professors and specialists in their fields don't do that. They want something else. And if they don't do it, they want their spouse to be able to do something during the day while they're working. So that's where it's really important we get this up to make, to give our town more structure, more vibrancy, and more of a wholesome experience where, and some of these people who complain about it will be driving to Melbourne for a specialist appointment, and they don't realise if we had had Sam, that specialist might have been relocated to Shepparton because he would have been happy with the lifestyle, the wife. It's a part. It's not the sole answer, but it's a part of it. I know Councillor Summers shaking her head. She can't see that vision, right? But I can, and I think it's extremely important. I see, as every councillor does, we're all concerned about cost blowouts, and none of us want to do that. All of us want to be really, really stringent on the money that's going to cost us. And I see the biggest danger to this failing is the SAM Foundation not coming up with their dollars. That is a really, really crunch time, I believe, because that should nearly have happened the same time as a tender comes back. A tender will tell us exactly how much it's going to cost us. Also, SAM should have had most of their money done by then. So that's when we'll have the opportunity to say, okay, it's definitely a go, we're doing it, or no, look, it's just not working out. So that's
Thank you,
my
Councillor
thoughts.
Patterson. Thank you for that. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Giovanetti?
Just following on from Councillor Patterson and Councillor Hazelman, I think that the crunch word in this is currently we have an estimate. We're not going to know the total cost until such time as tenders have been called. And that's the time, I believe, when we will get a better indication as to where we're going to be with SAM. I agree with Councillor Hazelman that I think we need to look at the numbers and how that they are stacked up in relation to the foundation as well as the other commitments we have. There is room there to manoeuvre that around, and I think that's something we will probably have to do, because I think the figure that was sold to the public of 34.5 million is one that we need to stick as closely to as we possibly can.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Hazelman?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Look, I really welcome this report because it's going to focus everybody's attention on what the real issues are. The real issues are of delivering an outstanding public project within a price range that is both manageable and both acceptable. And I think to do that, we need to, on a more regular basis, bring forward information to the public in terms of how we're advancing, how we're developing this project. And Councillor Giovanetti is right. This is one part of the process that ultimately the proof of the pudding is going to be when we go to a public tender process, and what that tender looks like and what variations, if possible, it is that we can make to that final process to ensure that we get the outcome that we actually want within a reasonable range. So I think that some of the priorities from here are to, yes, I know there's been changes at the foundation. I know they're moving in a slightly different direction, but as a council we probably need to have that broader discussion with the foundation, because that's in some ways is the missing link in the project. And that's the area that people will focus their uncertainties on, the capacity of the foundation to generate the range of dollars. As I indicated in my initial comments, I think there is some scope to have discussion with the foundation to provide a degree of more flexibility around the application of their funding, and I think that might, with more flexibility, might enable them to achieve some better outcomes than maybe we thought was possible.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. We will now go to the vote. All those in favour? Against?
Division, please, Madam Mayor.
Motion carried. Division, can we please note councillors in favour? Against?
Should read them, name them, call them out.
Sorry, all those in favour, Councillor Hazelman, Councillor Giovanetti, Councillor Adam, Councillor Sutton, Councillor Patterson and Councillor O'Keefe. Thank you. And those against, Councillor Summer. Thank you. Councillors will now go to item 8.2, Greater Shepparton Sports Hall of Fame, revised terms of reference and appointment of committee members. The recommendation is on page 25. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Giovanetti.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As Chairman of Greater Shepparton Sports Hall of Fame, I'd like to move the recommendation on page 25 that the Council adopted the revised Greater Shepparton Sports Hall of Fame Advisory Committee terms of reference and appoint the following 5 community members to the Sports Hall of Fame of Advisory Committee for a term of 2 years, commencing on 21st of Feb and concluding on the 21st of Feb 2020. Those members being Darryl Butcher, Ian Fitzsimmons, Don Kilgour, Margot Costalian and Lana Young.
Thanks to Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor
Madam
Patterson. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. This committee was formed 2 years ago and has done a sterling job, I believe, in the last year's Hall of Fame dinner that we had, where we presented 27 sports people from Shepparton who have competed for Australia at either Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, and or represented their country at the elite level. The function that we had on that night was probably as good as I've ever attended in Shepparton. It was very well run, thanks to Belinda Connor from the Active Living and Team Leader Healthy Communities. The committee is made up of 2 council representatives, being myself and Councillor Patterson. Belinda Connor, as I mentioned, the Manager Active Living and Team Leader Healthy Communities, and one representative from Valley Sport, and the members that we're about to vote onto this committee. We've got some terms of reference we have all agreed upon, and we've got some what's the word, Councillor Patterson? Exciting times ahead within the next 2 years in relation to more nominations to that Hall of Fame.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'd support what Councillor Giovanetti just said. It was a great night. There's some very passionate people on that committee, and I'd like to welcome Lana Young along. And it's great that she's there, because she's dropped the average age of the committee by about 20 years, I'd suggest. But there's a lot of experience in there, which is very important. And one of our big jobs coming up is to find a home now for the ward. So that's another job coming up, and we're probably looking at doing what we did last year, another year, 2 years.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak for the motion?
Yes, Madam Mayor. I'd just like
Councillor
to speak to the motion and actually mention the names that are on this recommendation. The motion is about appointing one of the points is appointing the 5 following committee members to the Sports Hall of Fame. So I'd like to welcome Darryl Butcher, Ian Fitzsimmons, Don Kilgour, which have already been on there, and Margot Costalian and Lana Young. I think it's worth mentioning the names of the people that we will be continuing on.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Giovanetti?
Just following on from Councillor Patterson, I think one of our next tasks is to ensure that we publicly show our recognition towards these 27 sports people. We've had some magnificent plaques made up and flags for each of the individual recipients, and I think it's very important that we continue on with this work and ensure that we can appropriately place those items where the majority of the public can see them.
Councillor Giovanetti, and I would also like to thank Councillor Patterson and Councillor Giovanetti for your contribution to this committee. We will now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, will now go to item 8.3, the Greater Shepparton Public Health Plan update on page 29, and the recommendation is on page 30. Would a councillor like to move a motion?
Happily move the recommendation as printed on page 30. Thank you, Madam Mayor, that the council note the update and the progress of Greater Shepparton Public Health Strategic Plan.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Giovanetti. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Summer?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of this plan, because it's an opportunity to drive real sociological change in this city. As Dennis used the word holistic, I'm going to use that as well, because being healthy is more than just the absence of disease, as stated by the World Health Organisation. As an example of that, it's a bit of a generalisation, of course, but where you live largely determines the outcomes of your life. If you were born disadvantaged, you're more likely to smoke, be obese, to die earlier, be less educated. And it sounds awful, but that is an actual fact. Obviously not true for everybody.
Yes,
and
thank
if
you,
you were more
Councillor.
advantaged, you would have a longer life, you would be healthier. And council has a part to play in this because we have a fund that is supposed to go towards public infrastructure. And that is one of the things that can drive healthy communities. So footpaths, street trees, things such as simple things like that can actually make all of our city healthier than we're actually seeing it right now. We are partnering with RMIT, who's doing a study to find out where we need the most improvement as part of a livability audit being funded by state government for the tune of $30,000, which is really exciting because we're not actually going to know where to make these inroads unless we can map out what needs to be done. So already we've looked at childhood obesity, which is not great. We've looked at social disadvantage. We've partnered with Vic Roads trying to find out more about public transport, and we'd really like to make some changes so that this community is equitable and healthy.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Giovannetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
I concur with the words Councillor Summer has already just given us, but I also find it very interesting that whenever she talks about healthy lifestyles, obesity, smoking, she's always sitting beside me, and I'm probably not the best example for all of those issues. But anyway, I fully support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? For the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Summer?
Only, again, that I hope I didn't offend anybody.
Okay, we'll now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, will now go to item 8.4, Greater Shepparton's Public Health Advisory Committee for endorsement of membership on page 33, recommendation on page 34 and 35. Would a councillor like to move a motion, please?
The recommendation as printed on page 34 and 35.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Do I have a seconder, please? Patterson, Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
Oh, yes, thank you. There's about 8 partner organisations included in this committee and 5 community representatives as well. So as I was saying about collaboration with Vic Roads, with GB Health, Primary Care Connect, all of these people who are specialists in their field coming together to try and facilitate mutually beneficial outcomes. It's just terrific.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, and as you're the council rep on this committee, I thought you might like to have a say. So please feel free to do that, Madam Mayor, if you like.
Thank you very much, and I will, and it's a very important committee to be part of, and obviously this committee is very mindful of our local health issues and moving forward in a positive, healthy way for our community. So thank you for giving me that opportunity, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor also like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Summer?
No, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, we'll go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 8.5, section 86, special committees, committees of management memberships on page 39, and the recommendation is also on page 39. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Patterson.
I'll second the motion, Madam Mayor.
What would you like to move, Councillor Patterson?
The recommendation on page 39, please.
You and Councillor Adams seconding.
Yes, indeed.
Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'd like to thank Anne Thompson for her time in the Koala District Hall Committee, and I'd also like to endorse the application to Annette Hunt, who has joined the organisation. We speak long and have really in trouble as the community is, so they do a great job. So I'd like to, first of all, thank Anne for her time, and hopefully Annette has a great time on the committee and helping out.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
Look, Madam Mayor, I'd just like to echo Councillor Patterson's comments and just remind councillors that every Section 86 committee is by definition an extension of council, so they're doing great work on our behalf. Thank
you, Councillor Adam. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Patterson? We'll go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 9.1, January 2018 Monthly Financial Report on page 43. The recommendation is also on page 43. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Patterson, what would you like to move?
The motion on page 43. Thank you.
Do I have a councillor to second the motion, please? Councillor Giovanetti. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, quickly. Year-to-date actuals are going very well. It's 34.24 against the forecast 32.86. That is basically due to early rates. A lot of that will fall away as we get closer to the end of the financial year. It'll balance out and should end up spot on. Capital works are going very well. There's 40.44% of our capital works are spent, and there's a commitment of 60.72 to be spent, which is already committed, so that will continue. And I might have missed something, so I'd like to hand on now to the Director of Finance, Mr. Chris Teitzel, in case he's learning something.
I think you've done it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Patterson. We'll now welcome Chris Teitzel. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Mayor, and Councillor Patterson did a sterling job, so there's not too much more to add. There's a couple of variances on the stoplight report around statutory fees and charges that are showing as being down at the moment. That's largely related to building regulatory fees, the building inspections and the like. They typically tail off a little bit towards the end of the calendar year and the beginning of the new calendar year over the Christmas break, so we're expecting that will normalise by the year end. Likewise with employee costs, we're showing an unfavourable variance there. Employee costs are up due to the additional activities in the active living space, particularly around aquamoves and the outdoor activities. We typically put on more staff to run those activities for the community over the summer period. All of those will normalise by year end is what we're expecting at this point in time.
Teitzel. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
I really can't add much more to what Councillor Patterson and Mr Teitzel have already said, but I'm quite astounded and amazed actually at Councillor Patterson's knowledge and his ability to read the financial reports. I think he did a sterling job in that.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Patterson?
Oh yes, I've just learned a lot of my financial management by going to lunch with Councillor Giovanetti. You learn very quickly, believe me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We will now go to the vote. For those in favour, against, motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 9.2, 2017-2018 Quarter 2 Forecast Review on page 45. The recommendation also on page 45. Would a councillor like to move a motion?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'll move that motion.
Councillor Adam.
On page 45, that the Council adopt the revised forecast identified by the 2017-2018 Quarter 2 Forecast Review.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Sutton. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
I won't be so bold as Councillor Patterson to attempt to explain the detail of this. Although, having said that, quite seriously, I think it is, it's an obligation of council to fully understand the financials, and as much as we don't, and we probably should actually present them as councillors to the council, I think it's just the accounting jargon that Mr Teitzel is more familiar with is the reason why we usually turn to him, and that's a great segue for me to turning to Mr Teitzel and asking him to give us a more detailed representation of that recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr Teitzel.
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. A second forecast review for the financial year, and it's picking up some changes in actuals that we didn't anticipate through when we did pass the original budget in June last year. Having said that, the changes aren't significant in the main. In the income statement, we're showing some increases and decreases in our normal operating revenue, but the bulk of the $1.2 million change in the bottom line on the income statement relates to an increase in the donated assets that we receive from developers for the new subdivisions and the road assets and those sorts of things that get contributed to us and recognised as income. So of that 1.2 million change, $1 million of that is represented by that amount. The capital budget is where the bulk of the changes happen at this stage of the year, where we pick up some unders and overs, if you like, in some of the projects that reach completion or need some additional work on them. And those projects are identified in detail in the reports that you've got in front of you. But the biggest one is a decrease in the expenditure on Cosgrove, so we've deferred some of the big expenditure on the Cosgrove 3 landfill development to next financial year. That equates to a decrease of about $2 million. The other projects that are increasing, so offsetting some of that decrease, some works on Verney Road, some works at the Sports City, and some other minor projects on Welsford Street, Seven Creeks Estate, and some works at the runway that have all contributed to a net increase of $760,000 on the capital expenditure. All of this together has minimal impact on Council's liquidity and its other financial ratios, so we're in a fairly good forecast position based on this review.
Thank you, Councillor. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Tiles. I nearly gave you a new title.
I certainly don't aspire to be a councillor.
Councillor Sutton, would you like to speak to the motion? Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak to the motion?
I'd just like to take the opportunity to... it's been harder for councillors and staff this year with the different rating system we introduced. So it's put our figures out from year to year. Year to year is fine, but during the course of the year, a lot of the rating money is coming in a bit earlier, and that is not to get the money in early so we get interest on it, because interest is worth very little. It is to stop people getting in financial trouble who haven't made any provisions for rates getting into February. Now, that currently there's a rating strategy out that we're looking for input from our ratepayers to see if they're happy with it done that way or not. So I'd encourage anyone that's out there that has a thought on it, please get your thoughts into us for the rating strategy, and we'll be deciding in the next few months whether we go back to the way it was or stick with this way. So that's what makes it a bit difficult to compare, this quarter to the last quarter. Income's different.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Adam?
No, thank you, Madam Mayor.
We'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, will now go to item 9.3, exercise of delegations policy on page 48. The recommendation is also on page 48. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Giovanetti, what would you like to move?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to move the recommendation on page 48, which is that the council adopt the exercise of delegations policy 37.POL2 version 2.1.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Summer. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
This is basically, Madam Mayor, an amendment to our existing delegations authority, where a couple of months ago we increased the CEO's delegated authority from 400,000 to 500,000, and that needs to be reflected in the policy.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
That's pretty much a nutshell of what this is about. It's just a very minor change, minor in terms of the alterations to the delegations policy. I'll just flag that we can still make changes at any time to the delegations policy, even before the major review, which is 6 months after the 2020 election. But as it stands, we had resolved to increase the delegation, so we had to change the documents.
Councillor Summer, would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Giovanetti?
No, it's all pretty self-explanatory, Madam Mayor.
We will now go to the vote. Those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 10.1, Draft Nixon Street Bus Interchange Concept Plan, January 2018, endorsed and released for public consultation on page 50. The recommendation is on page 51. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Summer.
Happy to move the recommendation as printed on page 51.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Do I have a seconder, please?
I'll second that.
Councillor Hazelman. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is basically just a draft concept plan for a bus interchange at Nixon Street. And the reason that we're doing this is because way back when we were talking about Andrew Fairley Avenue, we did some traffic studies, and it turned out that it's quite dangerous around that area at school drop-off and knock-off times, and also when work finishes. So it was listed as an urgent problem back then, and now we're taking some action to correct that. We want to go ahead with the upgrades to that intersection, but there is the complication of the bus stop, which needs to be moved prior to doing anything. So I think it's good foresight that we're actually considering what to do with that before we go ahead. We're repurposing GV Link funds, or proposing to, for the purpose of these, and it's a $2.25 million investment. Putting kids at risk isn't something that we like to do, so if a problem is flagged, we can go ahead and try and fix it. The super school came up as a question. Do we really need to move a bus stop when there's a super school coming? But we can't wait forever. We don't know when that's going to be built, so we need to just go ahead and do what we can now.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Hazelman, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Look, the upgrade of the intersection Balaclava Road, Horden Street, New Dookie Road, Verney Road necessitates the existing bus interchange being moved, and the northern side of Nixon Street between Harold and Skane Street has been identified as the appropriate location. Now, of course, that's all subject to a consultation process that people who are potentially impacted, residents in that nearby area, will be given the opportunity to provide feedback, and at some future council meeting that feedback will be taken into account before a final decision is made.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Summer?
Madam Mayor.
We'll now go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 10.2, Draft Wanganui Road and Ford Road Shepparton Feasibility Study Design Report 2018, endorsed and released for public consultation on page 60, and the recommendation is on page 62. Would a councillor like to move a motion?
Madam Mayor.
Councillor Patterson, thank you. What would you like to move?
I'd like to move the recommendation on page 62 as written.
Thank you very much. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Summer. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, there's a lot of people being very concerned about this. There's a lot of work being put on it. This is a draft that's been released to the public for a period of 8 weeks. They will all receive a copy of the plan, and what we're looking for is them to have a comment, to have a look at it, to see if they can make any suggestions, what they think of it, and then it'll come back to council. During that time, there will be consultation with groups. They can come and meet with councillors, council, whatever they want. We're trying to find an end to this problem, and we believe it is a problem, there's no doubt about that. It needs a road like this now, and this is before there's a bypass. So something needs to be done, and this we believe is the best option. So we're putting it out for all the people out that way to have a look at it and see what they think and make submissions to council. It's going to have to go there. As council, I know I'll speak for every council here, we've looked at different spots where that bypass could potentially go, and the only feasible one I could see was through Congupna, and I went after speaking to Councillor Javedi yesterday, I went for a drive out through there and measured it from the Golden Valley Highway to Grainvale Road. It's 2.5 kilometres, which is the area we're talking about. If we were to encourage the bypass to go through Congupna, it's 13 kilometres, so it's 10.5 k's longer. We will not get anyone in a truck or a car even to go that extra distance, so I'll go straight down there. So it's very important that we get it right. So I was quite surprised at the distance differential in the two options. So Yes, I'd encourage everyone to get a copy of it, have a look, have your meetings, whatever you want to do, and then make submissions. Council will be available all the way through it for discussion and to help in any way we can. And please have a good look at it and get back to us.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
Madam Mayor, I just want to stress that this is just a draft. Now, I know myself and many other people have been contacted in regards to this plan, and I would like to just send a message that now is the chance to be heard. So we need you to have a good look at it, like Councillor Patterson said, and come back to us with the right process and let us know what you're thinking. Now, there's no doubt we do need a bypass, but unlike Councillor Patterson, I don't believe it necessarily has to be there. It's going to take a very long time for the state to actually come back with $260 million for stage 1, I believe. And if councillors and officers deem the social and amenity risks to be too high, we would have to go back out and look for other options. So please get your submissions in. We do need a bypass. It will reduce congestion and improve safety in the middle of the CBD. It'll probably boost small businesses and have a healthier, more functional CBD. But it's not our intention to intentionally go out and force all of those problems onto a residential area either. So this has always been the identified site, but it can change.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? Councillor Adam?
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. I don't know whether I'm really speaking against the motion. I do object to the point 1, endorse the draft feasibility study design report. I'm quite happy to release the draft and note the council officer's report on any feedback, but endorsing it is exactly that, endorsing it. And in reference to Councillor Patterson's comments, I don't think all councillors are fully unanimous in their thoughts on this particular option. We've had extensive briefings on this, and the alternative options were put forward, and they were discussed in some detail. I think we need more detailed exploration on those other options. So I'm quite happy to do the point 2 and 3. I won't move an amendment or even try to. I'm just making my objection to that point 1.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Would any councillor wish to speak for the motion? Councillor Giovannetti?
Madam Mayor, look, I do support the recommendation to allow residents of Ford Road to access the draft report, and I'd implore them to take the time to read the draft in detail, and it is available on Council's website. I sympathise with the residents affected and can understand their concerns. From a pure logic position, is Ford Road the most logical route to take for a bypass? Well, yes, it is. Is Ford Road the most economical option available? Well, yes, it is. But my concern is the development of Ford Road since the 2006 Greater Shepparton 2030 strategy. Since that time, we've seen the expansion of Hawkins Heights developments, the Connolly Park Estate establishment, the recently commenced Vines residential development and the new aged care facility on the corner of Ford and Verney Road, and the new, I believe, proposed residential development on the corner of Ford Road and Dawes Road. Considerable development in a short period of time. Is a bypass road conducive to this residential development? Well, I'm not sure at this point. It's now up to the residents of the area to advise us, councillors, of their feedback so we can consider their feedback at the expiration of the public comment period.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion?
I don't know whether I'm to or against, but I too object to the word endorse because I don't particularly endorse this particular plan. I don't really believe that it's the right spot to have a freeway, which is what it will be, going through a residential area. And as Bruce pointed out, it has been built up quite a bit since 2006. And whether it's not, I don't really believe it's the right place. We have to look at another option. I know we've had them on the table and everybody, the council staff has said, well, we can't do it here, we can't do it there, but I really believe that we have to start looking for something else other than Ford Road.
Clarification, Madam Mayor. Would Councillor Sutton like to move an amendment that point 2 and 3 be accepted?
I've not a point of clarification. Do you want to do that?
Would you like to clarify what that amendment is, please?
suggestion across the table.
Sure.
Madam Mayor, can I just clarify the word endorse? When the organisation puts out a document for community consultation and a significant document like this, we don't put a document out unless council. It is an important document. We need to get it right, so it needs to have that status. When we're talking to a number of people, a number of objectors and a number of interested parties, it needs to have a document of a certain status, and that's the reason why that word is there.
Thank you for that explanation.
Well, if we don't have an amendment being moved, we're still in the process of moving.
Okay,
this
so would any
motion.
councillor like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Madam Mayor. Very, very briefly, look, the purpose of tonight is to simply release the documentation out for public comment. It wouldn't be my intention to debate the pros and cons, merits or otherwise of Ford Road. I think we're best leaving that to the residents to come back and tell us their thoughts and views of the world before we reach any conclusive type decision. So I'm more than happy for it to go out and more than happy to hear the community's comments.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Patterson?
Yes, I'd like to make a couple, please, regarding Councillor Adams' comments about council's happy to look at it. I was referring to, and I believe I said, I could be wrong if I do apologise, that councillors were happy to look at anything. You know, we weren't closed to Ford Road's going to be it, right? We had a look around at everything else. And that's what I've been doing. I'm surprised with Councillor Sutton's comment that there's another option, let's look at it. Well, that's what we've been doing for 6 months. We've been looking for other options. The only viable option I could see was Gutner, and when you measure it, it's not an option. So, as Councillor Hazelman said, we're putting it out there and we want comment back. So, you know, it's in your hands now. Get out there and have a look at it and see if you're happy with it or you're not happy with it, and make your submissions and talk amongst one another, and we'll wait to hear what comes back and then we'll discuss it and make a decision.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. We'll now go to the vote. For all those in favour? Against? Motion carried.
We have a division, Madam Mayor.
Can we please note those in favour? Councillor Hazelman, Councillor Summer, Councillor Giovanetti, Councillor Patterson and Councillor O'Keefe. Those against? Councillor Adam and Councillor Sutton. Thank you. Council will now go to item 10.3, use and development of land for a solar farm at 6.10 Ferguson Road, Tatura East. In relation to items 10.3, 10.4, 10.5 and 10.6, at its ordinary council meeting on the 21st of November 2017, the council resolved to instruct the Chief Executive Officer to write to the Minister for Planning, requesting that the Minister for Planning become the decision maker in relation to these applications. By letter dated the 13th of February 2018, the Minister of Planning has now given notice that the Minister has agreed to the Council's request under the Section 97C of the Planning and Environment Act 1987. Accordingly, the Minister is now the decision maker for these applications. The current recommendations for items 10.3, 10.4, 10.5 and 10.6 are therefore no longer applicable. Council officers have prepared alternative recommendations, and starting with item 10.3 as mentioned, this alternative recommendation is shown on the screen. Should be up on the screen. Would a council like to move a motion? Is it up, Councillor Giovanetti?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'm happy to move the recommendation that's on the screen before us.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a second, please,
I'll
Councillor
second the
Adam?
motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yeah, this is again another very contentious issue. We, as councillors, felt that we didn't have the necessary expertise nor knowledge to be able to conclusively make a decision on this, because there are so many different schools of thought in relation to solar farms, but not a lot of evidence to back up some of the claims. So what we felt as a council was that we would refer it to the Minister, who has the staff and the knowledge and capabilities to be able to determine what we would like to see is a statewide policy on solar farms, which would guide all municipalities as to when they receive applications such as what we have. And I think this is probably the best and fairest way for all concerned.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. Yes, I fully agree with Councillor Giovannetti. This is an important issue. We obviously, as a municipality, encourage any sort of new industry to our region for the obvious reasons of there is, I think we should be at the forefront of solar generated power in the state, if not the country. Having said that, there's some valid concerns by the community members, and we've been privy to many of them through several meetings with objectors. The point is, as Councillor Giovannetti clearly pointed out, I don't think we've had the time, we don't have the knowledge, the expertise, or the resources to gain that expertise in sufficient time to make a decision on this. Now, the Minister's taken this on board. No doubt, as Councillor Giovannetti also pointed out, they do have the resources, the expert advice, to either confirm or debunk or refute any of the claims made by the objectors, as I said, or to confirm them, to give us a better idea and place us in a better position to, well, at this stage we won't be voting on it. It'll be in the hands of the government at the end of the day via the panel. So I'm looking forward to them actually producing a factual response to the objections. I'm also, I'm looking forward to the objectors also putting forward their case, and they'll be putting it forward to a bunch of experts, which I don't claim to be in this field, or I don't think any other councillor claims to be as well. I think that's the actual best result we could have hoped for. So let's hope the correct decision is made ultimately.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Would any councillor like to speak against the motion? To the motion? Councillor Summer?
I think it's responsible what the Minister's done. They did follow through on what we'd asked them to do before. It's just renewable energy in general is something that we're not quite on the front foot with. I know that the state government are driving this. They've been set a target of renewables and they're sort of thrusted onto us to make a decision. And as you've heard, not one of us are privy to the ins and outs of solar panels. So we were really struggling with this conflicting use with irrigated farmland versus renewable energy. Technically still a farm, but our irrigated land could be diminished somewhat. So potentially what could come out of this is a bunch of guidelines very similar to what they've got in New South Wales, directing councils on how to make these sorts of decisions. And it could be up to us to try and identify some kind of potential site that these areas would be more appropriate for. I know they want to be near the grid, but as we've heard, these are multi-million dollar projects, so any additional lines under the ground potentially could be a negligible cost for them. We need to look at it closely and not just shunt it off to the Minister. This issue is not over, and I'm keen to see what the Minister decides.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion?
Yes.
Councillor Patterson?
I agree with the other three councillors, especially Councillor Summer. What we're really looking for is a statewide policy document that when it's done, someone comes to us with a proposal, we can look it up in the development plan and say, yes, it meets this, or you have to do that. We don't have to go down the road of trying to make decisions about irrigated land, that there's a conscious policy statewide that we can follow. Planners are happy, we're happy, the developers are happy, everyone knows where they're going, and that's what we need. And they're in most other industries, they're in wind farms. We've got one in Victoria for wind farm, there's one wind farm, I think, and there's going to be a heap of solar farms, so I've got to do it, it has to happen. And I think another thing, Councillor Giovannetti was not critical of councillors, and he was right that we didn't have the expertise or the knowledge, but it's not actually there, because you have both sides of the argument coming in with something off the internet and arguing both aspects of it. You know, so it's not defined even on the internet with studies that have been done. They're too vague. You can pick them to go each way, whichever way you want. So we need, the state government has a lot more resources than us to develop a policy, and then we're more than happy to stick with it.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Hazelman?
I always thought anything on the internet was automatically right.
Not Facebook.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that. Look, I think we've seen with the introduction of new technologies in recent years, whether they be telecommunications towers or wind farms, that the government has responded with the development of appropriate guidelines for their installation, issues around buffer zones. And with all those new technologies, there's usually as well comes forward opposition that may be made with the best of intention, not necessarily with the best of science. And so it really does need government to establish some firm guidelines to enable local government to make informed decisions. And I think in relation to this region, we obviously have concerns about the impact on viable land that is capable of being irrigated. Irrigated agriculture is still the backbone of this region, and we need to ensure that whatever guidelines come forward, that irrigated agriculture is protected into the future. So maybe that's part of the aspect that our participation, because we're not going to be a silent partner in this panel process, we're going to be there, we're going to be an active participant to try and achieve guidelines that, yes, they will be state guidelines, but they're also going to be guidelines that are to our advantage and benefit in this region. And there's issues in there that we need to be very cautious and very wary about. It's the alienation of agricultural land and the alienation and loss of the water associated with it. That's important to this region. So maybe one of the things that we could look at is similar to the guidelines developed in the United Kingdom, where there are particular zones that identify land where you can have a solar farm, but equally as well, they identify important agricultural land where they're just simply a prohibited use. And that might be an aspect that would provide a degree of comfort and a degree of certainty, both for applicants who want to invest in this region, but also for our residents and that who wish to maintain their agricultural lifestyle.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Sutton?
I thoroughly agree with what Chris has said. In this area, we need to protect our irrigated agriculture and protect all the land that can be irrigated, because without that, we wouldn't have our products that we can send to market. We wouldn't have the water would go because it'd be sold off. So I just think that is the most important thing, is to protect the irrigated agricultural viable farming land.
Thank you, Councillor Sutton. I think all councillors have actually spoke to the motion. So any closing comments, Councillor Giovannetti?
No, nothing more than say that this process will be beneficial, I believe, to not only our municipality but all municipalities throughout Victoria once a policy statement is delivered by government.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. We'll now go to the vote. For those in favour, against, motion carried. So, councillors, we now go to item 10.4, use and develop 235 Victoria Road, Talagarupna for a solar farm. Again, the recommendation will be on the screen. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Is it up? Or is that you, Councillor Summer, wanting to move the motion? Yes? Yes. And do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Patterson. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Patterson. Would anyone like to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments? We'll go to the vote. All those in favour? Against? Motion carried. So again, we now go to a similar item, 10.5, to use and develop land for solar farm in Lemnos. The recommendation should be on the screen. Would a councillor like to move the motion?
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. A seconder, please. Councillor Adam. Councillor Giovannetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, Madam Mayor. I think we covered every aspect of it previously.
Councillor Adam.
Well, Madam Mayor, I have a prepared statement here. No, I don't. No, carry on. No, that's fine.
Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? To the motion?
Actually, there is something I forgot to mention. All of the conditions.
Closing comment then, yes. Councillor Summer?
We pass
Next one.
Sorry, Bruce.
Speaking.
Yeah, as Councillor Summer was about to say, the conditions that we've placed on this recommendation cover all of the concerns that we as a council have in relation to these solar farms, from minimum setbacks to for details of water tanks, etc., etc. We believe that the information that we've submitted to government will assist us and the applicants and the objectors in this particular process.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. So we'll now go to the vote. All those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 10.6, to use and develop land for a solar farm at 1090 Lemnos North Road, Kingupna. Again, the recommendation will be on the screen.
I'll move the motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Patterson would like to second. Just give me time to get my paperwork right this time. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Adam?
No, thank you.
Councillor Patterson?
I would like this opportunity, actually. The guidelines that are in there are proposed guidelines that we would have put in. There was a permit there that staff thought was appropriate, but in reference to what we were talking about before with the management policy, things like irrigated land, etc., weren't covered, and that's what we need this paper to cover. So just sort of point that out so we all understand.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Adam?
No, thank you, Madam.
We'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors will now go to item 10.7 on page 171. The recommendation is on 173, 174, 175, 176 and page 177. Use and development of land for a medical centre at 104 to 120 Graham Street, Shepparton. Before I ask for a mover, Peter Harriott would like to comment.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. On page 189, we note that Council received 6 objections. We've just recently received another objection and an additional objection which was further to an existing objection, so technically it's 7 plus an existing objector putting in a second comment. So just make that clarification. That's a correction to page 189.
Thank you, Mr Harriott. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor needs to move a motion.
I'll move the motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Patterson. Councillor Giovannetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
We've seemed to have a few contentious issues on the books this month, and it's nice to know that I've had the opportunity to move the motion on most of them, which I thank my fellow councillors for that. There's been a number of issues relating to this medical centre, which is to be located in Graham Street, just west of the I was going to say kindergarten, but I don't think it is a kindergarten or play school on Verney Road. Our planners have listed quite a lot of recommendations to meet. There's been concerns, obviously, from the residents in that area relating to drainage, parking, and a number of other things as well, and also conflict of interest in relation to Councillor Abdullah. But I can clearly state that Councillor Abdullah is obviously not here tonight, and she's had no involvement in any of these discussions that have come before councillors prior to this decision tonight. In relation to drainage, that issue has been attended to by council planning staff. There is going to be a 600mm drain across the front of the property to drain all excess water away, and it'll run into a 150mm pipe. That will not increase the flood water going into Graham Street. It may even reduce some of it. Parking is always going to be an issue in Graham Street, as we know. There's no answer to that. We've got 2 large hospitals there. We've got, which will be now 2 medical centres. Council have actually negotiated with the developer to have an additional 21 parking spots available, albeit they will be on
Gravel.
Gravel, thank you. I was trying to think of another term, but gravel's it. I believe that the medical centre itself, hopefully will bring in new specialists into the town, which will enable residents of Shepparton to obtain services that they previously have had to go elsewhere for. I don't think I can say much else, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yeah, there was a few objectives, as we know, and we've all been contacted them. They all have legitimate points, and we've discussed them, and most of them have been addressed in the document. Probably the most two important ones was parking. They legally have to provide 51 parks. They are providing 72 or 71 or something like that, so they're in excess of what they need to do, which will help that area. Some people were concerned that 20 of them were gravel, which they think they can just take them away as soon as they get their permit. They can't. The permit is for 71 parks. If they remove 20 parks, they are in breach of their permit. They can't operate. So I'm sure everyone will be onto that. The other one I had some concern with was the removal of parking on the north side of Grain Street opposite it. I couldn't see any rationale behind that, but after speaking to our staff and even the rationale I come up with was different to theirs probably. There is a turning lane or turning into the front of the building on the right-hand side heading east down Graham Street. Therefore, a car coming up behind will deviate around to the left of that, which will approach on the parking bay. Right, so therefore it'll disrupt the flow of traffic, which I thought will say, but they need a park out the front. But in hindsight, that park would be a very dangerous place to be because you're going to have cars cutting through there all the time. So I think there's only one house that's directly affected, and I feel sorry for them, but they do have got two driveways, and I think it is best safety-wise if that does occur. So I was looking at putting amendment in to remove that, but I'm not. So.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? Councillor Summer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is a difficult one for me to argue because it does seem to be in line with our policies, and I guess it's more of a protest vote because of parking in that area. Now, it is a problem, and I think it's been largely overlooked. We've had major developments there. Already we see people lined up along the street. I used to live in that area, so I've seen it firsthand. We're going to have a larger hospital, potential private hospital. There's kindergartens. It's actually becoming quite built up, but we can't keep allowing people to park on the streets without offering them other options. It's a great development. It will bring professionals to the town, hopefully, and it will also increase the economy of that area. But without adequate parking, and Again, I stress that it is part of our policy that they only provide 50 sites. If this was in the CBD, they'd be required to have 5 parks per clinician, but because it's not actually in that zone, they're only required to have 5 for the first clinician and 3 thereafter. But even with that, the additional 21 parking spaces in the overflow area more than make up for that. So I'll stress also that, as Councillor Patterson said, they will be in breach of their permit if they remove that overflow parking, because it is written there. That would have to be removed by another decision, and then there's another opportunity for people to make a submission then on an object about whether those 21 parking spaces will be removed. So if this went to VCAT, I can't imagine that we'd be successful, but I do think that we require some kind of parking overlay in that area before we continue to accept these permits.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Adams.
Yes, Madam Mayor. I am speaking in support of the motion, although I do feel for the residents directly opposite. As Councillor Patterson said, these are the residents on the northern side of Graham Street. I mean, we all get used to actually just pulling up our vehicles in front of our houses and sometimes parking inside and not. So I do feel for them, but if you look at the photographs, I think councillors have them in their agendas, and as do the public gallery, you'll notice there is a car parked in the photograph right there, and it's quite plain to see if there were cars permitted to be parked there, it would create an absolute safety issue. So unfortunately, those 3 or 4 car parks will not be permitted to have vehicles in them, and we'll move ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Will any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Giovannetti?
No, Madam Mayor, I think we covered it all.
Okay, we'll go to the vote. All those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, we now go to item 10.8, Planning Permit Application 2017 to 310 for the use of the land for dog breeding boarding on page 193. In relation to item 10.8, I wish to advise that as at 4:30 today, Council were advised that a failure to determine application has been lodged at VCAT. Therefore, Council cannot now decide on this permit. Council officers have prepared an alternative recommendation, which is now displayed on the screen. Would a councillor like to move a motion? Councillor Summer.
As printed on the screen.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Sutton. Councillor Summer, would you like to speak to the motion?
I'd like to point out that we were actually going to refuse the permit, which is pleasing. It received 62 objections, so obviously the issue of puppy farms is something that is quite strong in the community. It had questions around whether it was overcrowding, ethics. There was a potential change to the law coming up soon, which would make it a bit ridiculous to allow something that's allow something now and then be in breach of that law in a very short amount of time. State government were going to put more controls over that. So now that we have a failure to determine, because it's taken us more than 60 days to reach this conclusion, which is disappointing and actually supports perhaps the idea of a January meeting, I actually support that 100%. It's still our position to object, so we're going to go there and continue to argue the point.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Councillor Sutton, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, I'd just like to state that I would object to this application too. I don't believe it's compatible with the nearby land. We don't know what the amenity impacts would be. The scale of the operation is far too large for a puppy farm, for it to be able to keep it neat and tidy and clean, etc. So I'm quite happy to object to it, and I'm very happy that it's going to VCAT.
Thank you, Councillor Sutton. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? Would any councillor like to speak to the motion? Councillor Patterson.
Yes, I'd love to speak to it. Basically, Oscar's Law comes into force on, I think it's the 14th of April, and Oscar's Law is a law that stops puppy farms with excess of 10 dogs operational. So I can see this going to VCAT if the proponent decides to do that. I would imagine it'll be at least, as some Councillor Hazelman was saying, it's probably going to be September before they get to VCAT. That law will be already in and knock it on the head, which I'm happy for that to happen. This particular farm, I believe, had a permit for 10 previously. He couldn't stick to that then, and now it's trying to go to 100, so I have no thoughts. It's very basic and clear what council should do, and the minister will be able to administer the law.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Yes. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor.
It's rather unusual that the council gets taken to VCAT for non-determination of an issue, but in reading the report and reading between the lines, perhaps, that there's been occasion requesting of additional information that hasn't been forthcoming. So clearly that has helped run the clock down, and so the applicants at the very last minute have taken this step of going to VCAT. And as Councillor Patterson points out, the legislation is about to change. So I'm at a bit of a loss to understand why you'd venture off to VCAT when you won't get to VCAT before the legislation changes and it'll be dealt with under the revised legislation, or as Oscar's Law was pointed out. So the issue at VCAT that does concern me with the approach and the tactic that the applicants have made is that it does expose the council to the potential of costs at VCAT. But given the circumstances and given the nature of the application and the serious potential for conflict with future legislation, that's a cost that I'm prepared to wear.
Thank you, Councillor Hazelman. Would any councillor wish to speak to the motion? Any closing comments, Councillor Summer? We will now go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, now go to item 16.1 on page 200. Oh, sorry. Nope, missed one. Sorry. What did I miss? Oh. Sorry, councillors, Mr. Page here. Item 11, do we have any tabled motions? Nil received. Reports from council delegates to other bodies, which is item 12. Nil received. Notice of motion amendment or recession. Nil received. Documents of signing and sealing. We'll go to item 15.1, documents for signing and sealing. Disclosure of conflict of interest in relation to advice provided. Recommendation is also on page 206. Do I have a councillor wishing to move the motion?
I'll move that motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Do I have a seconder, please?
Councillor Sutton.
Councillor Sutton. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, not particularly.
Councillor Sutton, would you like to speak to the motion? Would anyone like to speak against the motion? To the motion? We'll go to the vote. All in favour?
I'd like some closing comments.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I think it's just we should actually read the recommendation just for the purpose of reading it, although I should have done it at the beginning.
That's okay.
The Council authorise the Chief Executive Officer to sign and seal the following document: transfer of lease, Hangar 9, Shepparton Aerodrome, 7810 Golden Valley Highway, Koala, from Yankee Echo Zulu Proprietary Limited to MJ Muller and RD Vibert. So if that's a closing comment, that
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Thank you very much for that.
You just wanted to say Yankee Echo.
Yeah, I did.
Vote.
Thank you.
All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, now we'll go to item 16.1, Council's Community Interaction and Briefing Program. The recommendation is on page 208. Do I have...
Move, Madam Mayor.
Councillor wishing to move?
Happy to move the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti.
Right.
Do I have a seconder? Councillor Hazelman. Councillor Giovannetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
Just briefly, Madam Mayor, it just gives a detailed look at what Council has been involved with over the period December to the end of January. One of the big things I think that we've all been associated with was the Australia Day events, which were all very successful in every town that we were in, and it just gives an indication to people that we don't always sit in an ivory tower and do nothing.
Thank you, Councillor Giovannetti. Councillor Hazelman, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, Madam Mayor.
Would anyone like to speak to the motion?
I'm hearing a little bit in the community that people think we're not getting out and about in the community, but this is living proof that we are. We do love going to these events, meeting people, finding out what they're thinking, and take away one thing from each event. So I can honestly say that this is my favourite part of council, actually getting out there and meeting everyone.
Thank you, Councillor Summer. Would any councillor wish to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments? Councillor Giovannetti? We'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Councillors, we now go to item 18.
17.1. 217.
Okay, now here we go. My apologies. Item 17.1 on page 217, Assemblies of Councillors. Would the council like to move the recommendation as a motion?
I'll move.
I'll second it.
Well, either way.
Councillor Adam, would you like to move the motion?
Madam Mayor, sorry, I'll move the motion as print, or the recommendation as printed on page 217. And the recommendation is that the council note the record of assemblies of councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Patterson. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the motion?
I'll just mention that it is what it is. There's a few pages there of all the dates and times that councillors have met or assembled, and it's all there for public viewing.
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Patterson, would you like to speak to the motion? Would anyone like to speak against the motion? Any councillor wishing to speak to the motion? Any closing comments,
No,
Councillor Adam?
Madam Mayor.
We'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. Item 18, urgent and other business, not included on the agenda. No. Confidential management reports. Item 19.1, designation of confidentiality of information. On page 218. Would a council like to move a motion?
Happy to move the recommendation on page 218, Madam Mayor, in relation to the, in accordance with section 77(2)(b of the Local Government Act, the council designates as confidential all documents used to prepare the following agenda item. Report 7.1, Contract 1785, Cosroad 3, Cell 1, Construction Panel Award. Recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Do I have a councillor to second, please?
I'll second that.
Councillor Hazelman. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, self-explanatory, Madam Mayor.
Councillor Hazelman. Anyone wish to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments? Councillor Giovanetti.
No, Madam Mayor.
All in favour, we'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried. We now go to item 19.2, designation of confidentiality of information on page 218. Do I have a councillor wishing to move a motion?
I'll move that motion.
Councillor Adam.
Madam Mayor.
Do I have a seconder, please?
Second it, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Giovanetti. Councillor Adam, would you like to speak to the
I think it's
motion?
pretty self-explanatory. The recommendation is that pursuant to sections 89(2)(b)(a) of the Local Government Act 1989, the council meeting be closed to members of the public for consideration of 2 confidential items. So,
Thank you, Councillor Adam. Councillor Giovanetti, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, Madam Mayor.
Would anyone like to speak against the motion? To the motion? Any closing comments?
no, thank you, Madam Mayor.
We'll go to the vote. All in favour? Against? Motion carried.
Come out there. You got to ask them.